I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
I'm back for an interview with Dr. Clifford Bates. Cliff is a professor at the University of Warsaw American Studies Center. He's also a longtime colleague of mine. We went to university together. We were in the same PhD program at Northern Illinois University, and so we've kept up with each other over time. And the other day I noticed that Cliff had a YouTube channel doing a lot of videos on Aristotle, which is his research emphasis. He's written a couple of books on Aristotle of late. One is The Centrality of the Regime for Political Science, which I assume has a lot to do with Aristotle. 2016, there's Aristotle's Best Regime, Kingship, Democracy, and the Rule of Law. And we will put links to his...
And another thing.
Go ahead.
This is the 2022 book, which is basically a notebook. It's a notebook on Aristotle's politics. It basically goes through the whole politics from book one to book thing, goes through it all. It's a study guide. It's
got it. Okay.
It's a how-to. You're going to study the politics. Well, it gives you. We go through the chapters explaining the outlines and structures, then giving maps and like graphs and things that I used to do all the time for certain key issues or certain parts of the chapter. Like book 5, the famous book 5, like a chapter on this, and that deals with the outline of the argument. Then there's lists of things, show how the lists are.
It'd be a great tool for other professors who are teaching the politics, which is a very typical book for us to teach at the undergrad level. And so I'll put a link to that also if there's a website people can go to.
Well, Lulu is the best. Going at Lulu helps me because I make the best more. I'll get the profit that Amazon gets.
Okay.
Okay.
That's always good. I'll ask you if there's anything I left out, but I do want to point people to the video you made recently called Celebrating the 400 Subscriber, which was just a few days ago. So congratulations for that. I was there about 3 or 4 years ago, and there's quite an appetite for political theory. So I wish you the best of luck. And this is a really good video for like you describing your background and stuff. So if people want to know a lot more about how you kind of developed and got where you are, that this is a good one, celebrating the 400th. But is there anything I left out that you want to particularly...
I also did Machiavelli's Prince. I did a thing on Montesquieu and also Thucydides. We read the whole Thucydides Peloponnesian War, reading it using the landmark Thucydides edition, going through it, and went and did year by year by year, season by season by season by season.
Yeah.
So that was the kind of thing I did because it's certain texts you can divide easily, certain texts you can't. Mm-hmm. Like Montesquieu was frustrating because you had to do it by book. Because if you did it by chapter, you'd have basically a dozen small 10-minute videos, and then you'd have to have an hour video on this one chapter. And sometimes some videos were like whole books were 30, 40 minutes, maybe an hour, then some wasn't. But then at the end, it became 2-hour videos, and one book was 4-hour video. Ooh. It's one of those big books at the end where, the last part of this, of Montesquieu. For me, Montesquieu was always like the modern Aristotle. It's like the modern, So, but Aristotle is interesting for me because, one of its language, you have to know Greek. You really have to know Greek to understand what he's doing. And the Greek is so multidimensional that the sentence in the Greek has both a kind of, has playfulness in the Greek that doesn't exist in most English. Like the word, like even the word for change, we call it revolution. It's constantly translated as revolution. It's metabole. But metabole just means change. It doesn't mean now. Most translators are saying, "Well, this is about regime change, changing a regime, so revolution." But I like to say, no, it's about change and political change, and it's small change. It's the nature of political change, and this is the difference between, let's say, Aristotle and Hobbes. See, the difference here is the Hobbesian world, because of how he constructs the state as a matter of willing. The idea is that everything is a product of consent and will, right? Mm-hmm. So therefore, the body politic is this generation of. See, there's no difference between. You can say there's no difference. Anyone who wants to say that, well, Rousseau is not Locke and Locke is not Hobbes, right? Nonsense. They're all the same. They're all arguing the same thing. The only difference is Rousseau is being more honest than Hobbes is. No. He's being Locke is disingenuous in relationship to Hobbes because he's trying to make Hobbes more palatable to Christians and to people who support the common law.
Right.
Because Hobbes rejects both. Okay. He's trying to. That's why Locke constantly cloaks himself in Aristotle, cloaks himself with a Hooker. Right? Remember second treatise? Hooker. Go look at the Hooker. You see him distorting Hooker. That's why someone like Dick Cox. Dick's Cox, wonderful edition of the second treatise.
Yeah, we use that. Yeah.
This is great. There's lots of errors.
Fools a lot of people, and actually fools a lot of people. And it's interesting how many people see Hobbes as some sort of like serious Christian as well, interestingly. But I mean, that's obvious. John
Jacques. I mean, I share Wilmore Kendall's position that John Jacques gets blamed for the crimes of Locke and Hobbes. And that John Jacques is a little more honest than they are. That John Jacques gets accused of being this horrible. Now, John Jacques accuses himself of so many horrible things. Right? He accused, in his autobiography, he says, I had children, illegitimate children, I sons to he lied about that. This is not true. He loved saying bad, true things about himself. Things that we know that if you test it, look for the evidence of it, there's no supporting evidence for this. So Locke doesn't like talking about himself at all. Hobbes and Locke are quiet. They're like, what is that line between what is that Strauss line? That Hobbes and Machiavelli are different because Hobbes is kind of Holmes, Sherlock Holmes, and Machiavelli is Moriarty, right?
Okay.
Well, I argue is that poor John Jacques is almost the opposite. He's not a Sherlock Holmes nor Moriarty, but he's the one who's making fun of himself constantly.
So let's think about like what like Hobbes and Aristotle. Obviously, Hobbes hated Aristotle. I mean, maybe hate is too strong of a word, but like, constantly, was sort of saying, I'm not Aristotle. I disagree with Aristotle. So like,
his rhetoric. Accept his rhetoric. He liked the rhetoric and he translated the rhetoric. He just doesn't like Aristotle's teaching on regimes. And he doesn't like the democratic character of the democratic logic of his treatment of regimes. But at the same time, he uses it. See, this is a case where he attacks it, but then uses it, but he uses it in a way to advance a claim that Aristotle would not accept. And that is that the unnaturalness, the total artificiality and social construction of the political.
Right.
In other words, the political for Hobbes is merely a human tool, nothing more. A human product of human reasoning. And that's the whole modern position. This is why the book I was going to write was blaming on Hobbes. You want to understand Kant? It's Hobbes. You want to understand Hegel? It's Hobbes. This is my fight with the Claremonters who want to blame Hegel for everything. I said, no, I'm sorry. Not the administrative state is a product not of Hegel. The administrative state is a product of Hobbes, Bentham, and radicalization of Hobbes and Locke. In
Right,
other words,
right.
the administrative states finds its origin in England, not in Germany. Germany imitates it. And what Hegel's doing is an imitation of the English model. And remember, that's the whole Stadtler tradition of Stadtler, state theory. This is all liberal. I mean, I had this fight with some of the Claremonters about, you have to understand that these German legal theorists, Stadtler, is this all Hegel? I go, no, that's not true. They're all Pufendorf, and Pufendorf is Hobbes. It goes Pufendorf, Christopher Wolff. Kant tries to do something in his science of Verstand of Recht, right? In his metaphysical morals, right? In his metaphysical morals, too, there's there's the chapter on personal morals, right? And then there's the science of right, or the Stundrecht, right? And therefore you have this is the beginning point of this, but he really doesn't develop a science of Recht. Hegel does this, but Hegel does this because he's trying to respond to, he's trying to kind of give a defense of the Prussian state in light of this modern process, okay? This inevitability of freedom that's happening that he sees historically because of, again, that's the master-slave dialectic in his the phenomenology of mind, that the tension between master and slave working itself out, that when none are free, one are free, many free, a few are free, many free, most are free, all are free, right? That's history, okay? So everyone say, oh, progressives are hard, all the progressives are really Hegel. No, they're Hobbes. They're Bentham. Progressivism is Bentham. It's, come on, let's smell the roses.
It's the birthplace of liberalism.
Yes.
So just for the viewers to make sure they understand the contrast, you mentioned, Aristotle and the grounding in biology, right?
Yeah.
Of, what is human nature, what is the family, this kind of thing, the organic nature of the building up of the state. Just tell people why it was that Hobbes reacted so strongly against Aristotle, and why is that contrast important?
Okay, first of all, the word state is problematic because the state is a modern concept, wholly modern. Because it is not what the Greek's word is polis, which is not, it's city, but it's not state, because the state is the state, even from Machiavelli on. Remember, it's Machiavelli coins the word state. It's Machiavelli who coins the word. He takes the word status and status in status in Latin and stato in Italian, and that only meant what? The status of a thing. And he turns it into a thing, an instrument of will of the prince. And therefore Machiavelli coins our concept, the state. And then he takes it, and the Italian writers start praising this concept. The status of a thing, the status of a thing. Oh, it's called this the state. And it's Machiavelli who first coins it, but it catches on all through the Italian Renaissance, this period of Italian writing. And it then gets spread all through Europe, this concept of the state. This is Bottaro's, the Spanish writer Bottaro, I think he's Spanish, maybe he's Italian that went to Spain. Bottaro, The Reason of State. Okay. In other words, this transition that goes to Spain. Remember, Spain was very influential. France and Spain was very influential, fighting in Italy for power of Italy, and the French, these Renaissance ideas spread like wildfire through the Spanish and French court, and therefore and remember, Ferdinand is trying to justify both Ferdinand and the French monarchy is trying to justify his rule, and that's why Boudin is trying to Jean Boudin. That's why one of the most important books I've been spending my time in French, because there's no good there is a translation I have no access to it. The so-called 1956 edition published by Harvard University Press that does the whole 6 books. Because every time you get Boudin in English, it's edited. And all the good stuff is missing. All the esoteric stuff is missing. So Boudin is the man who takes Machiavelli's idea and fits it within the French context. Botero does it kind of in the Spanish. The Jesuits do this. The Jesuits like Suarez, takes Machiavelli. They say, I hate Machiavelli, but then they use the state and then applying concepts for this. So that's the one. That's a big issue. That the language of the political that Aristotle does, the polis, which is what it's again. There's two issues. There's the state versus the modern state versus the ancient polis, or the political, the city, the political community. Now, the political community was understood as a koinonia. It is in Latin, it's perfectus communitas, we get ideals. That's the translation of the Latin. It is the complete community. And by what is meant by the polis is that this is the place, because koinonia is this extreme thing from either the husband-wife relationship, parent-child relationship, all humanity on the other side. There is a spectrum of what koinonia means. The problem is, where does the human being are able to fulfill himself as human being? What form of koinonia is that peak Pareto optimality point, where human beings are able to fully be free, liberal, and to maximize their eudaimonia, their fulfillment as human beings, right? Happiness, we translate it as flourishing, right?
Right.
The polis is that. It's that mean point. The city is that mean point. Now, the problem with this is, well, there's size issues. You can't be too big. So politics is this idea of this size. It can only be a certain size. It can only be like at most 20,000, 30,000. Above that, it's no longer, you don't really know anyone. You have to, it's like, you have to be a typical human being, as we know from science, about scientific research of how many people can we know, our minds can know personally, around 120, 150, right? So therefore, if you understand that, and you understand at least 3 degrees of separation, you get no more than after 3 degrees of separation, you don't directly know somebody. You then rely only on opinion, doxa, belief. You don't know. Because this way, a friend of a friend could tell you. But if it's larger, it's a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend.
And then you're
therefore,
lost.
And you're lost. And therefore, you don't have political rule, you have hegemony. You have only coercion or economics. In other words, you can only have utility or things. You can't have friendship. You can't have common bonds. You can't really know each other. You can't really live together and know it. So therefore, there was a inherent, it's not organic, it's the nature of human nature. It's not like it's the organic. We say the word organic, we think growing from the ground. And therefore, but of course, this is how Hobbes kind of defeats a certain kind of Aristotelianism. Because of course, cities don't grow from ground, right? Cities are man-made. Aristotle even agrees that city needs the regime, the politeia, the plutuma, which are man institutions, right? These are created things. They're not natural things, but they fulfill a natural, right? They're not totally. It's not, and that's the big thing. It's like the same thing with beaver dams. You know, you had Larry. We both had Larry.
Yes, I do remember
the
that.
story about beaver dams. Beaver dams are not organic. Beavers make them, but without the beaver dam, there is no beavers could not procreate and survive.
Right.
And
there's better and worse beaver dams too.
Yeah. And also think about this beehive. The beehive is totally created by the bees. But without the bees making the beehive, they can't give birth. There's no possibility that the larvae grow to adulthood. So therefore, this idea of the city is not natural that Hobbes does. Well, if you look at the reality, that there are other animals that use their actions to create the habitat by which they are able to be their nature, to fulfill their nature. So that's why Aristotle is different from Hobbes. That's the difference. That the political animal, the idea of the political animal. But then we have a whole nother problem. That's society. See, we in English will say things like, what is it? We in English have this horrible habit of talking about treating society and community as synonyms.
Right.
They're not. In the Latin, societas and communitas are night and day difference. Societas is a contractual relationship, only a contractual relationship. It is the word they use to do business relationships.
Mhm.
There can be contracts between cities, but a city itself was not a societas. It's a communitas. And a communitas a societas always, it involves utility and choice. Therefore, the parties must agree.
Mm-hmm.
It's voluntary, wholly voluntary. Whereas a community is both the involuntary and the voluntary. Like the husband and wife relationship is voluntary, but the parent-child relationship isn't.
Right.
And much of human existence is not, even sexual attraction, is not voluntary. Pheromones and genetics, you know the reality of this. Much of things we think we have freedom from it's not true. We have choice. We're not totally determined. We have some choice and we have selection. But free will, absolute free will in the language of Kant or the language of some certain misreadings of even Aquinas and Augustine, that this idea of absolute free will, that's absurd. Particularly the Kantian radical free will. So therefore, Aristotle is this routine that does it. Hobbes is kind of like the father. See, Hobbes is the person who says, listen, it's all about will. It's the political community is a matter of choice and consent. He solves the political. Remember, Hobbes solves the political problem. Come on, he ends history.
Maybe you can clear something up for me, because you're right. I see him this way, that it's all about will. What we do is basically construct out of whole cloth, the social contract. At the same time, he says will is but the last product of motion. And he has this whole mechanical theory that seems so deterministic. So how have you squared that?
Because the problem with that is there is esotericism in Hobbes. And the esotericism in Hobbes is, at one style, he says, listen, there is this mathematical world. Remember, he's a student. He is the pupil and right-hand man of Francis Bacon. Remember that. He came, and it's through Bacon that he gets the Earl of Clarendon's position, right? That gets him a nice cushy thing that he spends all his life being able to write books and not have to, get in trouble. Okay.
Right.
Oh, for those days where you get a patron who I joke I have Patreon and that, but I have no Patreons. To have a big patron that gives me a $20,000 job and rooming. Those evil bad old days.
That'd be so great.
It would be. So one of the big things for Hobbes is see, the problem is you have to understand his idea of imagination. That it's all about fancy and logic, and the mind is working a certain way. And yes, there's like that. But see, will still exists in this radical sense, because you have to be able to. This is how we perceive things, but at the same time, there is choice, and therefore he has a problem that he can't resolve, and therefore he just pretends to ignore it.
I see. That's what I've always thought. But I thought, well, am I missing something? Or does he just sort of move on, basically? And you're saying,
you have to remember, you know this very well. Remember, he is the first English translator of Thucydides. He loves Thucydides. He was going to translate Epictetus, but he decided not to because he knew he'd get in trouble. Okay, he translated Iliad and Odyssey. Okay, in English. Aristotle's rhetoric, not his politics, right? Which is, in fact, he has a book called The Art of Rhetoric, Hobbes does, which he basically, most of it's Aristotle with a couple changes, right? That's the
plagiarism before it was a thing.
Yeah. No. You have to understand, because he couldn't publish a translation of Aristotle. That would be a problem. But he liked the rhetoric, so he kind of made it his own. And that's how he kind of did it. But for me, Aristotle's always been the regime question, right? The regime question is the kind of people don't like it's politeia. The word is politeia in Greek, And the problem with this, it's one of those, it's frustrating because most translators will translate it as either it's constitution, no, for a long time in the 1700s it was government.
Right.
The first English translation is 1776 by Ellis. And then 1789 by this other guy. I know his name is going to drop my head. I'm blanking now. In other words, he criticized Ellis for being too under the influence of Locke. Okay, because Ellis will translate government, but he will. Treaty of government.
Yeah.
In other words, I mean, do I have a copy of the Ellis translation? Someplace hiding here. It's actually literally in English. Aristotle on government. That's the translation of the politics.
No, yeah, doesn't quite do it.
No, because that's the problem of but it is that in one sense, politeia does mean government. It does, but it's not only that. It means more. It means constitution. It means, but it means constitution in its original English origin. It was that in the 17th and 18th century, you'd say your constitution is your character, your health, right? I went on a morning constitutional walkabout sound, right? We don't use it that way anymore. The term constitution has meant to be a legal document and understood as a legal entity. So that's why constitution can't work for. That's why I even had a fight with Aristotle, because Aristotle used to like constitution for this. He liked Lawrence's Burns translation and was going to call it constitution still. I think even Joe Sachs uses constitution. I'm not sure. I think he echoed Lawrence Burns, what Lawrence Burns was going to try to do. I'm not sure because I remember him talking about it, but then I kind of got disappointed with. I got Joe Sachs translation, and I was disappointed by it because he gave no notes. And if you in Aristotle, you have to always give notes because why did you choose this word translation? I want to know why you chose this translation. Because it could be, if you're not giving notes, then there's something wrong. Now, if you're not even giving an appendix of why you've chosen certain words for certain words, if you're not going to do that, at least you give me and his vocabulary, his thing was very short, and which was surprising because that was completely different than how his book on the metaphysics and the physics were. So I was disappointed by it. So I kind of read it, and I just said, okay, it's interesting. I know people like it. Out of my Ken Misugi likes Sachs' translation very well. I know some people at St. John's like it, but no, it disappointed me. But back to the point of this word. What does this word mean? The problem with state is the polis is not the state. It's a completely different thing. The logic of it is completely different. But also the word society. Society is a word not known in the Greek. There's no equal to it. The closest thing that you could translate it would be alliance. How the Latins understood societas. The closest word, and even that wouldn't do because you wouldn't use it for business relationships. The way because remember there's this one when you read Roman history, they'll say social war. Well, the social war isn't a civil war within the society. No, it's a war between the different cities that are in alliance with that. So that was the soci are the alien cities that Rome are in contract with. Usually for the Rome holding the relationship with a little stick, saying, I'm bigger and stronger than you. Therefore, this is like alliance. That is how the Athenians and other cities ruled over and associated other cities. So there's something hegemonic. There is something, when Rome uses soci as a political term, it's less business and slightly more hegemonic. And I can also see this. I can also see why certain left-wingers looking at this from the Roman way of using soci in relationship to intercity relationship would view society as hegemonic. This explains why someone like Foucault and even Agamben sees social relationships as quasi coercive, always coercive, and never escape. Again, that's the problem with will. Once you accept will and society, remember, the social contract creates two things: Siamese twins, the state and society. The concept of society, as Hannah Arendt rightfully argues, the concept of society is a concept that occurs at the same time as the state.
Right. Hobbes uses civil society, right?
Well, no. And actually, even that's a very odd word. You know why? It's the Italian, the Renaissance translator. I want to say Fico. It's not Fico. It's, what is his name? Leonardo Bruni. Leonardo Bruni translates Aristotle into New Latin. Unlike Morbic, he uses different words. Or, politico, koinonia politicae, the political community. Well, in what Morbic creates new Latin words for the Greek words. In other words, he's more faithful to the Greek in his Latin. So he creates new Latin words to fit Greek words. So he makes communitas politicum. Well, Bruni doesn't translate this. He translates it civilis societas. And that is written, that becomes the Bruni translation of Aristotle, gives us our first origin of the word civil societas until Cicero also uses that word, civilis societas. In his De Republica, but that book is lost until the 1800s, so it couldn't influence modern times. And it's one or two letters he mentions it, but that is also him trying to address the relationships. He's not talking about the political realm. He uses that word about creating civility with the Rome being civil towards the society. Okay, so it's not, Cicero doesn't use it this way that Bruni does, and therefore this is a real radical change, and this changes everything. Because why? Because he's translating in Florence. Florence and Venice are what? Commercial societies. Therefore, they like the word societas, because societas is the business relationship. And Aristotle even says you have to have, in ethics, you have to have reciprocity, that the communitas requires reciprocal relations. Without reciprocal and equal relations and proportionate things, there can be no reciprocity, and therefore cannot be any community. So therefore, you can see why Bruni chooses it, but by choosing, and Hobbes doing this is echoing Bruni purposely.
Okay.
Because he knows he is calling it civil society. Locke is doing the same thing. But what is so disingenuous about Locke, he never defines it. The chapter, the thing about this that drives me crazy, the chapter that is supposed to be civil society, right? The political or civil society, number 7. What do we get there instead? We get conjugal society. We get a discussion of conjugal society. So this is this is what is so amazing about Aristotle, is that when you read Aristotle and then you look at the history of tradition, if you just read it generally about Locke, Hobbes, and you see the fights, you see them like going after each other. And the regime question, my God, you can understand regimes. And I prefer the word regimes to constitutions and those things. I say so why in this book. And also you can find it online. I have an article. It's available. You can find it online. It's available at different things. It's a chapter. It's my first chapter. The Centrality of Politeia for Aristotle's Politics was published by Social. I forget. It's a French journal. Social Science. Larry did it. Social Science. Masters got me published. Roger Masters helped me get published in that. So Social Science Information, in that sense.
Well, if it's online, maybe we can put a link to it so people can check it out.
Well, you can find it. It's not as online, but it's usually available through JSTOR or Google Scholar and something like that.
Okay.
And so I have it on my academy.edu page, and also on my page on what we call ResearchGate. I have
ResearchGate. Okay.
ResearchGate and Academy.edu are things European academics are kind of forced to do, and also ORCID, We're
Mhm.
forced to get on these
Yeah.
social media things to post our things up there, because we have to have open access to everything under EU law. So it's
Yeah.
hilarious.
And we've got maybe 10, 15 minutes, and I want to make sure, because I think this is all kind of leading up to, you know, why, looking at this from the outside, a lot of folks, they are interested in political theory, but they're not like political theorists themselves. They're trying to learn, you know, particularly based on like what's going on right now, in our politics in the United States and in Europe. Why is it that we should still pay attention to Aristotle? What does Aristotle and his view of regime, his view of, human nature add to our understanding that, say, the Lockean, more modern liberal perspective does not?
Okay, first, an understanding of human nature as political, and that evolutionary psychology and all these sciences, modern science, that tells us about human behavior. Aristotle is not. See, the problem with the Lockean idea, it depends, and Hobbesian idea, it depends on will, and this radical understanding of will and free will that is at odds with modern psychology. Okay, so you have this problem here. That's one. So therefore, at a philosophic anthropological level, Aristotle's understanding is more in agreement with what modern science says about the nature of human beings and their socio-political behavior, okay,
Mm-hmm.
and their group behavior. Two, Aristotle, Locke and Hobbes, first of all, Hobbes and Locke kind of ignore society. Okay, this is why Montesquieu is so great, because Montesquieu returns to society and says, well, there's this thing called society and nations, and that actually kind of important because they shape political things, right? Therefore, the sub-political does help influence the political. Family, the kin group, these things, the nation, the people, right? These things are the matter, the material that the political requires. Okay, so Aristotle also is good because he's also a non-Marxist, but a Marxist. Right? What do we mean by this? Aristotle still believes in things like class and in other words, the few, the many, and also not that there's different manys, there's different fews. The way of life you choose. What is your way of life? What is your employment? In other words, what is the way of life of many? There's different manys. Trust me, there's the farming many is completely different than the dinosaur, the physical laborers. In other words, physical laborers are the most dangerous. Why? Because they have nothing. They have no resources. They're the really dangerous class, many. So not all the many are equally good or equally bad. And the problem with the few is that the danger of the few is likewise the problem. The few, the oligarchic problem is when the oligarchs become so extreme, they're just as bad. In other words, the extreme oligarchy is the rule of just a very few who are so powerful. This is book 4, chapter 11, where he says the problem is the very rich and the very poor. In fact, the words he used, it's the same. It's prior. Prior means goods, resources. The wealthy are ou prior. That means they have lots of wealth.
Mm-hmm.
And the poor are a prior, alpha privative, without goods and resources. The poor, being without resources, they have nothing. They're servile. They have nothing, and they're afraid. They're servile. They'll sell themselves to survive. But because of that, they're also rapacious. They're envious. And therefore, if a society becomes too poor, it's unstable. It will never be stable. It will be always vicious. And the problem with the wealthy is that they're so used to command, they don't know how to follow. In other words, they're used to, this is the problem with the trust fund kids, trust fund millionaires who have been spoiled all their lives, and they believe that they're entitled. It's like the children of the communist. I live in Eastern Europe, Poland. It's like the children of the communist elite. They were entitled. They have an entitlement to this. And what happens is they demanded that they be that the transition required that they get all the wealth, the private property and the institutions that were publicly held in common. To buy peace, they were given it. So you had a new oligarchs, but these were the what? They were the old oligarchs, the old apparatchiks and the party elites. So therefore, they're what? They're used to command. They're used to getting their way. They look at the average person as, oh, you're a slave. And they treat you as the average person as the slave. So these two groups are completely, and this is the problem. The problem we have to understand what Aristotle sees about meso, the mean, right? It doesn't mean middle class. This is why I had to fight. I mean, God bless. I love Leslie Rubin. I'm sad that she died. Leslie Rubin death, tragic death of a car accident. Being hit on a road in Princeton by a car. She didn't. Thank God, Mary Nichols helped finish the book. Help her edit the last book to publish the book. But I even I have major problems with that book. And I said, her problem is she assumes the middle class, the modern middle class, is the middle class of Aristotle. My argument is no. The modern bourgeois are not Aristotle's mesos. The mesos is, it has enough. It has enough resources. It's like the small farmer. It's
Property,
the farmer.
Right? It has to do with actually owning something, not just making it. Yeah.
And not only owning something, but not having too much of it either. Not having it so much that you don't need anything. In other words, there's a sense that you are responsible for it, that you did it. So this is some. I like Victor Davis Hanson's stuff on the Dying Citizen, who says the modern Greek miso is not necessarily the farmer; it's the truck driver, the independent truck driver, or the small businessman. This is not the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie of old now have become, in fact, Rousseau's critique of the bourgeoisie is absolutely correct. It's and the criticism is that, and it echoes Aristotle's. I think this is funny. His critique of the bourgeoisie echoes perfectly Aristotle's critique of the wealthy. All of their cosmopolitanism, their disdain for the top of their city, of their entity, they only care for their own interests. They prefer talk and conversation. This critique of this. In fact, even Schmidt makes fun of this. Schmidt uses a very Rousseauian critique of the bourgeois in his analysis of liberalism, and why it is unstable is because they talk and talk and talk and talk. And what happens is, instead of deliberating when it needs to be deliberated, they just want to continue conversation. Because this is how by continuing conversation is a distraction from the fact that they're ruling everything. So conversation is a distraction. So this is why we have, again, our distraction now is gender politics. Why do we have gender politics? Transgenderism is a distraction from the real fact of economic domination. So that's
all that cultural stuff. Yeah, people get wrapped up in.
Aristotle analysis offers us a means by which we can address issues of class that doesn't get into the Marxist dialectic nonsense of class. In other words, there's no trajectory that there's inevitability of the victory of the masses. No.
So Aristotle, actually, there's different readings of Marx that don't even employ the dialectic as a major concept in his later work, right? Like that particular view of Marx.
No, it's his early work,
but
it's the opposite.
Early and very late.
But it's not Marx. It's Marxist thinkers, particularly in the late. The problem with that is that Marx himself was too systemic. His early situation, he does a little bit this way, but then once he gets his insight of the dialectic, the Hegelian dialectic, then he's gone.
Well, all I'm saying is that there's aspects of Marx's thought that can be deployed without the dialectic.
Well,
not that Marx himself may or may not have.
But the problem with that is, there was a very good book on that about labor and the theory of labor done by a Marx, kind of someone who's trained by Marx. But the problem with that is you can't escape his understanding of objective capital. and the idea that there's objective value, and there's no objective value. That's just nonsense. Value is a subjective construct. In other words, the good, even Aristotle
even
would
that
agree.
has been, I mean, and we don't need to get into this because
Yeah.
this would be a whole nother thing, but like even that has been sort of debated. And all I'm saying is that Marx, Marx isn't necessarily an impediment, or Marx can
Well,
actually be somewhat helpful to understanding.
yeah, but I would say that certain Marxists
Sure,
of the
Marxists are
19th
largely
century,
dogmatic ninnies.
well, no, but there were some good ones. Like, the Neil, come on, what's his name? Neil Wood. He was a classicist, M.I. Finley, the famous Marxist classicist in England, the English, and then Neil Wood, who wrote Cicero, booked on Cicero. Mm-hmm. Now, his wife, Ellen Merskin Wood, is probably she's fantastic. Her 2-volume history of Western civilization, where she goes from citizens to lords, right? And then her criticisms of freedom, right, about modern liberalism, right? It's a history of political thought doing a Marxist lens, but it's one that that criticizes. She then attacks the Pocockians and the Skinner-Pocock people on one hand, and she attacks the Straussians on the other hand, because she considers the Straussians are just elitists, right? Which most of them are. I was sympathetic to her critique of that. I thought she herself saying, "But hey, wait a minute, but that's not Strauss. Don't confuse the."
Yes, it's not Strauss. Exactly. There's Straussians and then there's Strauss. But yeah, no, we love Ellen Woods, and that. Her analysis makes a lot of sense to me, and it's been very, very helpful. And yes, I mean, it can go along with, I love the way that you're explaining Aristotle here and his view of class. It's an important dimension that we want to ignore these days, is that we can go on and we can, pursue equality without, or something close to equality without class. So it's.
I'm trying to remember her name. I know who she is. A friend of mine. She's at Berkeley. I mean, I met her at a northeastern. No, where was it? It was at the Midwest, or maybe it was at a northeastern convention. And I think it was in Philadelphia, where she was giving a paper. I went to see a paper for someone else, and that guy didn't show up. And she gave a paper in Greek philosophy about this. And then who was in the audience with me was Cliff Oren. I know Cliff Oren. Cliff Oren's wife was one of the editors of my LSU book. Okay, I found this out like years ago, that she was she ended up being the editor of my LSU book. I said, "Oh, that's a weird world," because she was a librarian who did editing work on the side. And they're both retiring. They go to Europe a lot and things like this. But I was at a conference and he was there. And there was this, she was a student, a Harvard grad, student of, not a Mansfield, but that English guy he was the guy who was the Skinner colleague. Oh, come on. He retired just recently, as with Harvey. He was a Skinner, one of the part of that, the Skinner Pocock crowd, who left, not done. It's going to drive me crazy. The name is, I'm blanking on the name. He's very famous. He did a book on early natural right theories. Tuck.
Yeah, I was seeing the book.
No, but Tuck repudiates his natural right book, saying that, Strauss was right. He does this in 1980s. Okay, that Strauss was right about Hobbes and Locke. And that was like, actually, I met Skinner, and Skinner in his new version of Machiavelli says Strauss was right about Machiavelli. It's like, what? Like, oh yeah, Machiavelli's being playful. Is Strauss got it right? When you go back originally, because that's a product of Don't You. Mario Verrilli, who got kicked out of Princeton because of the fight with that analytic guy, because the analytic guy accused him of plagiarism. And he probably did plagiarize from the analytic guy, because the analytic book is so meaningless on Republic. Verrilli wrote a book in Italian about republicanism.
Yeah.
And he was kind of stealing some of the analytic model. And the Italian scholars do this kind of way of quoting things. And then what happened was someone else translated it. And then the guy, I forget, I'm banking on his name, because he's such an anal retentive ass. I hate him, got Princeton. Not Robbie George. I mean, this is an analytical guy, okay? Hardcore Republican. Prippit? I don't know.
I don't know. You've described a lot of people.
Well, what happened was that he drove Verrilli to leave Princeton. This is what led Tom Pangle to offer him a job at Texas. So Mario Verrilli, one of the Italian scholar that was very important to the whole Cambridge school, right? And Verrilli's book on From Politics to Reason of State is an outstanding history of how this language translation works. So this contextualist understanding of language is very good. This is something Straussians don't do well. Mm-hmm. They don't do the historical analysis well. Don't like it. They don't do the philology well either. That's the other thing. So Verrilli at Toronto, who left, had to leave Princeton. Tom Pangle brought him in, and right now UT Austin is the only place that you can have Straussians with Cambridge school people at the same department.
That is special.
You understand? And there's been a rapprochement because of this. Because they believe in texts. Both of these, they believe in texts. Now, a lot of the hardcore Skinner might have reproached, because Skinner wrote a book on, once Skinner started looking at art, he made an accommodation with Strauss. Because once he thought as the artist, then Strauss is right about textual meaning. Once you turn to art, looking at David's statue, the statue of David, in his book on Shakespeare, he said, well, maybe artists have different meanings and not pure context. Yes, artists do create meanings as well. So that's led him to Strauss again. And his students, the second generations, are very dogmatic still, and they constantly don't cite Straussians. Like I was just joking with someone about this wonderful edition of what I call the How-To series, which has Greek on one side and English. This is all about flourishing. So it's not the whole ethics. It's it's from book 1 to book 10 of the ethics, all the sections that deal with flourishing, with Greek and English side by side. So this is a good way to kind of learn how to deal with Greek language and text. Mm-hmm. But even here, this person who does a wonderful job will ignore all the scholarship done by Straussians. Just ignore, not cite. It's their way. This is because do you know what the danger is? If you cite them, they get credit. Even if you criticize them.
Yes.
If you criticize them, that's why Claudine Gay didn't cite what's her name, Carol Swain at all, because if she even quoted it or criticized it, Carol Swain would have gotten points and citation references that would have raised her status.
Oh boy,
raised her status as a scholar.
We need to get past this, and these different schools of thought need to speak to each other like that. I mean, what are we doing it for? If we're just kind of like living in our little silo and we're talking amongst ourselves.
We have to remember academics. What does Kissinger says? Academics is the place where the stakes are the least, but the viciousness is at the maximum. Right. This is the problem. I had a colleague who joked. He said, because he was into all these 1930s science fiction novels, like The Worlds Collide. Right? He says, "Well, what is university? Where fantasy worlds collide." University is where fantasy worlds collide.
Well, let's hope we can punch through into the real world here. We're both in YouTube. That's probably kind of, I don't know how many people from NIU, from our cohort are doing this, but I think that's kind of special. Your stuff you've been on since 2006, right? Yeah. A friend asked me to make a video. I did it, and then I sort of liked doing that, and then I just started doing it. And
your style and my style are completely different. I never liked PowerPoint. I hated it. I had to do it when they forced me. When I do lectures, they make me do PowerPoint.
I don't particularly like it, but I don't know what else. I basically use it as prompt for myself, basically, and for something for people to focus on. But I kind of like your approach of throwing the book up there.
Well, that's the trick. Once you put a book up there, I can then not have the text, and I can have myself there, Because my rule, I was always taught this by Mel and other rhetoricians. A PowerPoint is bad because people pay attention to the PowerPoint. You should not be paying attention. You should be paying attention to the speaker in discussion.
True
So
enough.
therefore, you need to have them paying attention to you and only point to the PowerPoint when you are trying to make something. Well, but having the text there, you can always have the text there. And of course, YouTube is not the greatest quality of text, but it's still there, and you can zoom the screen a little bit, and then you can see what I'm pointing to, the text, and going through it line by line by line, and just read it, explain it, and that's how I handle it. And then my Friday sessions, I have a live stream on Friday where I kind of just simply go over what I'm doing, what I've done, and I talk about some issues. So it's every Friday at it's about 11 before 12 o'clock. It's 11 o'clock around Eastern Standard Time. I usually do a live show Fridays, which is about 5 o'clock my time. Okay. And I do an hour. I try to do an hour, but it ends up being an hour 50 because someone will pop on the screen and say, "Did you talk about that?" And I go, "Okay." I'm not big enough that I don't get super chats. I know people. I'll say this: I really did this in response to what I saw on YouTube, because I was kind of saying I was seeing all these people doing like Sargon and other people of the whole Gamergate world go on to talk about political things, and they were simply, and even this guy I know who's very important is academic agent who's his name is, he's an English professor. He was a professor of he's Persian English, but Parvini had like 4 or 5 books on Shakespeare, academic books on Shakespeare, and basically, but he got interested in libertarianism, Austrian school stuff. And therefore, he became a diehard Austrian economist guy. But then what happened was, by being on YouTube and meeting this stuff, it became kind of alt-right. And because he hung out with Curtis Yarvin and those crowds. And you know who Curtis Yarvin is, don't you?
Yeah, I do.
I can't take Curtis Yarvin seriously. He's a smart guy, but he doesn't know anything about history of texts. I mean, this idea that this obscure English writer who was very famous on great man theory is a great thing. He's a second-rate Rousseau. I forget what's the guy's name. They all love this English writer who talks about the great man and history and And I said, this is Rousseau. This is bad Rousseau. But this book is his Populist Delusion. Is a good book. In fact, I would recommend it to students who want to study elite theory. The problem with it is he makes certain dumb mistakes that if he was a political scientist, if he was better trained in political science, he wouldn't make. And what's even worse, his Prophets of Doom is, again, example of this. These are good books on the alt-right. They're interesting. But the problem with them is that they make too many kind of amateur theoretical mistakes that they don't know the tradition of political thought. He knows Shakespeare. He knows how to do scholarship. But he knows economics because he learned all this Austrian. He hung out with all these Mises Institute things and went to conferences in Mises in America a dozen times. And he also the British version of Mises. So therefore, he became part of the Gamergate group in Sargon, and he became famous. He makes more money on. He make more money on. He could quit university. He quit teaching because he was never going to be a professor. He was always going to the British system. He's a lecturer. He was always at a second-rate, third-level school, not a permanent position. He have lecturers. Lecturers are not adjuncts. They're full-time professors, but they're lecturers. And even with his books weren't. They were good. He had like 4 or 5 academic books that were. They were, in fact, Shakespeare was kind of like, I call it pure English literature higher criticism. So it wasn't like someone like Paul Cantor, and in fact, he didn't even know. Even though Paul Cantor was connected with Mises people, he didn't even know Cantor. So it was like weird, and it had a. This is how I got into this, by saying I started doing YouTube's kind of, and I started going on super chats for them because why? Because because I was correcting them. They were saying kind of stupid things. And then what happened when someone said, why don't you do a YouTube video? So I started doing that. That's
yeah. Well, and I mean,
well,
that's
it's
a good
nice catching up with you.
Yeah, same here. Thanks for coming on.